faces. So welcome everyone to our webinar. I am on systems mapping. My name is Ticoulat. I am a research and investment associate here at TransCap, which mainly means I work with our prototyping work, our experimental work on bringing the systems, the systemic investing theory into practice, bridging that, experimenting with different tools, frameworks, processes to make that come to life. And one of the tools we like to use is systems mapping. And so our talk today will be about the specific tool, how we're using it, and I would love to have a good conversation about it. I know there's some people here in this call that have been using this tool for quite some time. And so the idea here is not to be a unidirectional kind of information flow, but rather have a conversation. So we'll do a little bit of presentation at the beginning, and then we'll go into Q&A and more of a conversational style at the end so that we can make sure that this is useful for everyone in the call. And over to you, Johannes.
Thanks, Andre. Hello from my end also. Lovely to see so many people here. I'm also research investment associate at TransCap, also working on prototyping, and parts of this presentation are based on a specific prototype that I'm leading at the moment and have been involved in for the last 2 years. So very excited to dive into that topic a bit deeper in a few minutes.
Fantastic. Now, before we start, I'm curious, just with a show of hands, who has been involved in a systems map before? Okay, fantastic, most of you. Now, who has done or been involved in a systems map with the focus of directing capital? Okay, interesting, fantastic, thank you for that. I'll share my screen now. Hope you can see that. Okay, so let's begin this webinar. I'll start with what this is and what this is not. So this is not supposed to be a systems mapping 101 course, but we will do a short introduction about systems mapping just so that we can establish some benchmark knowledge in the room. And then we'll go into the next phase of the presentation where we'll be talking about systems mapping more specifically into the context of systemic investing. Okay, so today we'll be talking about maps. We'll not be talking specifically about London's tube network map, which is what you'll be seeing here. But the point of this is to show that all maps are wrong, but some are useful. So like this tube map, it is a simplified and ultimately inaccurate map, but it's really useful to help you to get to point A to point B. And so today we'll be asking ourselves, how can we create and participate in systems mapping that is useful for investors? And more specifically, useful for investors that are investing for systems change. So at TCI, changing systems is at the core of everything we do. And the question of how systems mapping can be useful to is one of the many questions we're working on and experimenting within our innovation space. And we hope to share a couple of the learnings. So before we go into how we are specifically using systems map, just a brief introduction into systems mapping. So not surprisingly, systems map is a particular kind of map where you hope to map a system. Now, systems is a combination of elements and connections that together exhibit certain behaviors and patterns. And so in a systems map, you map the elements and connections that are bounded within a predefined system boundary, your scope of analysis. Now, systems mapping can have many different objectives, such as the analysis of the current dynamics of the system that you're interested in researching, or you might be using a systems map to uncover blind spots and assumptions about that system. You might be using the systems map as a communication tool and to define and build shared understanding of said system. Or more abstractly, you also be using a systems map to aggregate information. Now, systems map can come in many different shapes and forms. from very large, big picture and potentially overwhelming maps to very focused and potentially reductionist map. This is not to place a value judgment on which map is better. It's all dependent on the context you're in and what is the ultimate objective of mapping that system. There's different levels of depthness and effort connected to that. And there's also different types of data that you might be using to build such systems map. There are also very many different types of maps. So you might be interested in mapping specific stakeholders and initiatives around specific nodes or leverage points or initiatives. You might be interested in mapping the system's drivers and barriers. So this is an example of the prototype I'm involved in, regenerative agriculture in the Midwest, where I was really curious about what is pushing and pulling the systems towards the transformation from conventional agriculture to regenerative. You can also be interested in mapping the causal dynamics and feedback loops of such system and building narratives of why the system is in such a way, describing the dynamics of that system. You might be also modeling systems and dynamics based on loops, stocks, and flows, much more of a quantitative approach for systems mapping. This example here is from Alban. The process can also vary. So you can solely focus on a map that is led by your internal team in your own organization, or it can be a highly participatory process in which you are integrating different perspectives, different stakeholders into the conversation and into the process of building such a map. This is interesting because it allows, again, for different perspectives, and arguably it helps for you to create a more comprehensive map in which you are integrating many different perspectives and viewpoints into such system. Now, some will argue within the systems mapping world that the process of system mapping is its ultimate value. So the value is in the process and not so much in the output. While we at TCI, we don't necessarily prescribe to that philosophy, it's nonetheless evidence that the process is indeed informative. So following that logic, we believe involving other stakeholders in the process has many different benefits, such as external sense making over internal thinking. It helps to collaborate and start to form a coalition around the efforts to transition such a system. And it helps, again, for you to have so connecting to the beginning where we said that all systems are inaccurate, by including other stakeholders to the conversation, you kind of decrease the probability of that being very inaccurate. So especially in the context of systemic investing, where ultimately it's a matchmaking exercise between different types of capital, the different nodes of the system, it's interesting to bring different perspectives. And therefore, the process that we're going to be talking about in the net zero mobility prototype, you're going to notice that it's a hybrid process where we did our own internal systems mapping, but then we validated and sense checked that with external stakeholders. For more on that a little bit later. Okay, so far we've established that there are many types of systems map and also different processes for carrying out the mapping exercise. And now you might be asking, which type of map and which type of process should I be using in my own project? And unfortunately, there isn't a one-size-fits-all answer. It largely depends on the variables and ultimately what you're trying to achieve with such a map. So broadly speaking, if you're wanting to map stakeholders, so it's a stakeholder map, you would be then carrying out the stakeholder mapping exercise. And the scope of analysis will depend on your budget and time and your resources, the knowledge of the existing system, the knowledge of the existing actors, and also internal knowledge and capacity for mapping such a system. So now we'll be moving on to talking more specifically how we use systems mapping in the context of systemic investing. Johannes, over to you.
Great, thank you, Andre. Yes, so how can system maps be useful for systemic investors? We see systemic investing as an emerging practice. That's a combination of intent, mindset, and method. And systems mapping is one important tool in the toolbox on the method side of things. As you all know, it's well tried and tested. There's many organizations out there who've used it for a long time already with considerable experience. And we at TCI, we don't aim to become or be systems mapping experts. We come at this more with an approach of experimentation to try to see how does it best work and how can it be useful in the investing context. So how do we do this? Let's move on, as we said before, and look at a specific prototype. Our prototypes are essentially our testing grounds to apply systemic investing in practice. And much of this presentation is based on our learnings from the net zero mobility prototype in Switzerland, where the idea was to utilize mapping to understand and gain holistic understanding of the system, to understand the dynamics of the system and understand how we can transition it, to identify leverage points, and to anticipate potential effects and monitor the impact. So we can stay at this slide for a moment. What you see here is essentially the basic idea, how we applied systems mapping to gain an understanding of the lay of the land, as we like to say. On the net zero mobility prototype, we try to work on the mobility system in Switzerland, more specifically the individual mobility system in Switzerland, with intention to transition it to a more sustainable state and specifically drive the transition towards net zero emissions by 2050. It's a complex system with many elements, many interconnections, and especially many interconnections in adjacent systems. So if you want to just go back one slide, Andre, we can see it's about mobility. If you think about clean mobility, that always connects into energy. So suddenly you have questions around energy grid, where does the energy come from? It always connects into questions of, if you think about electric mobility, where does the energy move into the modes of mobility, so the car, questions about charging networks, also questions about other modes of movement, other modes of transportation, things like car sharing, bike sharing, and all these things that are coming up more and more. And then also sustainable mobility is very strongly connected to traffic planning, urban design. So all of these questions somehow opened up when we looked into the topic of the net zero mobility transition in Switzerland. And the mapping exercise helped us to sort of be mindful of all these various other domains of the system that are very important and drive the behavior of the system, but it also forced us to at some point draw a boundary. And that's maybe one of the very first important lessons that we learned from this mapping exercise as a tool for analyzing the system. So to summarize, systemic investing is insights-driven investing, and we think system maps can be very helpful to capture these insights. So here on this prototype, we used mapping for analysis to create the causal loop diagram that you can see on the right. But we also used it for collective sense making and alignment. This specific map was not created in an office by myself over the span of a year, not talking to anybody. We did try to bring in as many stakeholders as possible through individual conversations and also through collective stakeholder workshops to test our hypothesis, then go back, build on our map, present it again to stakeholders, adapt and iterate to get to a version that is close enough to reality and resembles the key dynamics that our stakeholders identified. And we think we also use this map as a tool, as a communication tool. We're testing it with investors currently, have tested it with stakeholders, as I said, based on the assumption that we think maps intuitively transport this, for us, very important notion that we are working on complex challenges, wicked problems, and they don't have silver solutions, have silver bullet solutions. And if you look at this map, it becomes quite intuitively clear that there's very likely not going to be the one element that you pick out, and magically the whole system is going to fall into sustainable wonderland. So as I said, systemic investing is insights-driven investing, but it's also directional. And this means our analysis work through mapping around the status quo of the system is always contextualized and informed by a specific transformative intent that we, together with stakeholders, have set for this specific system. Essentially, we like to call it a future landing zone. And here you can see an imaginary image of a future transportation system in Switzerland that's more sustainable. So we developed this strategic transformative intent together with other stakeholders based on research, based on existing work on sustainable futures that's already out there. And then we use that to A, build our map, and B, ask ourselves the question, well, how do we transition the system now from the status quo to this future? And that leads us to a key feature of causal loop diagrams, which is the type of diagram that we used, and that's feedback loops. In theory, there's two different types of feedback loops. We can just move to the next slide. There is balancing feedback loops and reinforcing feedback loops. And in this specific map and in causal loop diagrams in general, they are key features to convey the dynamics that happen in systems that go beyond monocausality of A influencing B, but making clear that there's always actions leading to effects that influence, that have feedback effects on the sources of the initial action. And these feedback loops, they can produce stability, but they can also produce instability, which must not necessarily be good or bad, and can, in some cases, actually be desired. So in our mapping exercise, you saw the map before. We tried to reduce that to more understandable and more intuitively understandable pieces of information by looking for feedback loops. And here is one specific cluster of feedback loops, just as an example to make this a little bit more clear. So in our systems map, one focal question was, what are the dynamics that lead people to consider transitioning to electric vehicles? And for that, as we've heard from many stakeholders, charging infrastructure is the most important precondition. If you don't have that, you're not really willing to ever consider shifting. It doesn't even really come up for people or factor as a realistic option. Now in Switzerland, most people do not own their flats or houses, but they're renters, which actually puts the onus of action for new infrastructure on the owners of the houses and apartments. And those in turn don't really see a need to invest in new infrastructure unless there's sufficient demand from their renters. So it's a weird chicken and egg problem, and a key feedback loop that keeps the system in its current state and is a key barrier to transitioning towards a more sustainable mobility system in Switzerland. So we used this approach and we used the map to identify all these dynamics, all these balancing and reinforcing feedback loops that currently shape the system and cause it to be in this present state of dynamic and essentially cause it to remain in place and hinder or at least slow the transformation towards net zero by 2050. So the question that, based on these feedback loops, we think that they are very important to then consider thinking, okay, well, how can we now transition the system? So we have these feedback loops, how do we need to rewire them to make sure that that either we break out of a balancing feedback loop that's currently blocking the system, or that we support a reinforcing feedback loop to run even stronger and even stronger, to essentially then work towards this vision of a more sustainable transportation system. And there's many ways to do this. Thinking about the charging infrastructure example, that's per se not necessarily transformative. It's probably more a case of system optimization that is then going to sort of lead to technology substitution from combustion engine cars to electric vehicles. There might be interventions that actually lead to partial redesign of the system. For example, interventions around the broader clean infrastructure nexus. So thinking about the energy generation infrastructure, all of that sort of leading to a redesign of the socio-technical energy mobility system nexus. And then there's some feedback loops that actually, where we think they do have the potential to drive a more holistic transformation. For example, if we look into the urban spatial and traffic planning regimes that are currently in place, and considering, well, how would these feedback loops need to be amended to lead to essentially a car disincentivizing state, where people are encouraged to share their cars or use different modes of transport that are more sustainable per se. Now, all of that, all of these thinking around feedback loops, all of the thinking about how this can inform our hypothesis around transition pathways. Now the question is where to intervene. And we utilize these key feedback loops to identify hypotheses for leverage points, which are essentially elements within the map that can have outsized effects on specific loops and then further impact that ripples across the entire system. Now, that being said, it's still important to note that we are working in complexity and leverage points are not silver bullets. So in this map, I tried to mark some of the leverage points we identified. And as you can see, there's not one, there's several. And in all likelihood, there's also not one that's more important than the others, but they're all going to be needed in some shape or form to really shift this system. And it's also important to note that we are working in complexity, and it's an incomplete picture of reality that we've drawn with this map. And it's very difficult to validate the findings around the leverage points. The specific map was created in Kumu, and it is possible to use the tool Kumu to sort of identify elements within the map that do have very high potential for impact across the entire system. But all of that is essentially based on the biases that the creator of the map has sort of drawn into the tool, which is why for us, identifying leverage points was again essentially a participatory process where we try to bring in as many experts and stakeholders with important stake in the system into a room to validate our assumptions. Now, what do we use these leverage points for? You can see a selection of them here. And we essentially use them as anchors for thinking about interventions and what to do now. And one thing that you can see here, for example, if we look at a specific leverage point that might be charging infrastructure in rented condominiums where various people and families live, we use this to think about, okay, what are possible interventions together with our stakeholders, what needs to happen to break up this loop. And that could be, we need providers that make the whole infrastructure installation and administration process easier. We need one-stop shop solutions. So that's something that came out of workshop that we conducted, and it's essentially one intervention that we identified along a series of others. And this can be done top down, so to speak. So based on our analysis, identified together with our stakeholders. But we also did this in a more bottom-up approach where we just went out, looked out at solutions that are already out there. Companies, startups, deploying their products and services in service of activating these specific leverage points. So to summarize, the leverage points are important anchors for us to think about how do we might to intervene. It's also important to say, and we can jump to the next slide, it's also important to say that these leverage points and when setting up a map, we tried to keep the perspective of financial capital out of the process for as long as possible. Which means that when creating this map and identifying the leverage points and thinking about interventions, this also led us to interventions that are not necessarily investable propositions per se. And there's actually lots of other interventions that might be deployed to activate these leverage points. And many of them might not be attractive at all for investors. So there's some where financial capital is very much geared towards, for example, the scaling of existing solutions. We think about growth equity and private equity, solution experimentation. So that might be seed money that goes into small new ventures. But there's also lots of other things that most likely need to happen to intervene around these leverage points and break or accelerate the loops that we identified. And that might not be amenable to financial capital. When we think about issues of social norms and public awareness, when we think about the provision of data and knowledge across the entire system, but these are also important levers of change that we wanna be mindful of. And the leverage points, based on the leverage points and applying these filters, invites a polycapital perspective that goes beyond investable capital and also includes social capital, political capital, which essentially is a hallmark of systemic investing that we're experimenting here. And then if we move on to the next slide, leverage points for us are also anchors to think about the design of a systemic investing portfolio, where in the end, we want to bring in various types of capital, investable and non-investable, where we want to combine interventions around various different leverage points, and then think about, okay, how might these play together? Because as I said before, there's not the one leverage point that's going to solve everything, not the one intervention. But we think we need to design for combinatorial effects between those interventions and between those leverage points. And they provide a good basis for us to conceptualize some of this thinking. Okay, and lastly, the concrete question of how to intervene. And again, something where we think mapping can be useful. We have identified leverage points. We have identified a universe of interventions. We've come up with a strategic portfolio where we want to combine and bundle different types of interventions. And now the question is always, well, what will it lead to? And here again, we think that maps can be very useful to at least think through some of the potential effects and the ripples that go through the system. And while we don't want to be deterministic here and say intervention A will lead to outcome B, we think that at least maps can be helpful in determining, well, what are some of the risks of things we don't want to happen that might come out of us intervening in a certain way. So for example, if it's totally feasible to draw a map that only focuses an investor on electrification of transportation as a means to making transportation more sustainable, but there's obviously that obviously doesn't solve for many other problems that are out there, and ideally the map is holistic enough to draw the attention of an investor to the simple fact that there might be negative lock-in effects and negative side effects that are not desired, and also unintended side effects, as we can see here with the famous e-scooter example. So using these feedback loops to trace these and identify potential negative side effects might also be something worth considering, and that makes mapping an attractive tool. Okay, now all that being said, let's revisit our original question. Is it the one tool to rule them all? So based on our lessons learned so far, we do think it is a very powerful tool and an important tool in the systemic investing toolbox, but there's also a few caveats and callouts that probably lead us to say it's not the one tool. On the one hand, we think we think system mapping can have quite a big value add for its standalone analytical prowess, but we also think it's a very powerful integrative tool. So for us, on this specific prototype, and the same is true for Andre's prototype, we used lots of different tools, lots of different frameworks. But mapping was the system map and the cost loop diagram was very useful to integrate the findings that came out of all the other tools into this one central space. So we think that's a very important, that's what makes it a very powerful tool. It's also worth saying that, as we've mentioned several times during the presentation, mapping can only be good as the process that it's embedded in, and it's definitely feasible to draw up a process that's not participatory, that leads to outcomes that are not at all systemic. So we think participation is one of the things that's important, and sort of can help to mitigate some of these risks, and ensure that the outcomes reflect a very diverse set of perspectives, and are thereby more systemic in nature. Obviously, every tool can also be misused, and you can use systems mapping in a way that's still very much focused on and centered in a mindset of monocausality and complicatedness. So it's still, it needs somebody to apply it with an appreciation of complexity and of ambiguity and of uncertainty. In that sense, it's very different from many other tools that are currently widely used in the investment practice, and that give very clear-cut answers, which mapping definitely does not give. And then it's definitely no easy substitute to many other tools and approaches of analysis that are currently being used. It requires considerable amounts of skill, experience, and time. And there is organizations out there that have amassed experience and skill. And so we definitely think it's probably not worth investors' time to become the best systems mapper, but working with existing organizations out there that have this expertise, and then bringing the financial expertise to the table is probably the way to go to make systems mapping most useful to investors. Now, those are our reflections, our lessons learned, but we are very mindful that we have people in the room who have done mapping before, we have used it in the investment context. So we would love to hear other voices, other opinions, questions, concerns on this topic. Is it the one tool to rule them all?
Thank you so much. That was really amazing. We've had quite a lot of appreciation for the Lord of the Rings quotes in the chat, so thank you. And a couple of questions. Alexandra, I hope that I've pronounced your name correctly. Do you want to share your question, or would you like me to read it out?
No, I can share it. Thank you, Hannah. I got here I'm at Harvard Business School as an executive fellow in the Social Enterprise Initiative. So I've mostly observed other people map systems. I haven't really done much of it myself, but I'm very intrigued by it. It's sort of maps with them, I think. The reason I was asking, my question was, is there sort of a baby version of this that people can use that adds some value without spending a year and having the kind of expertise that you guys obviously have? Thinking about it specifically for a nonprofit that I'm working with that is very much trying to move towards systems change, and thinking something like this could really help them both understand the system as a whole, which is vast and complicated. It's related to healthcare, but also to start to identify some boundaries and then draw a map of the system that they want to intervene in. But I know I don't have the expertise to help them with that. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any suggestions. And I know it's a little bit off topic, so if you want to take it offline, I won't be offended.
Alex has just shared what looks like an excellent, I don't know what the word is, platform tool in the chat, but I don't know if anybody else has got thoughts, opinions, ideas.
Well, I think that's an excellent question, and pertinent. And there are a couple of ways of answering that. The first one is to say, the smaller your system boundary is, the less resource it will take to study that. And so if you don't have a lot of resources, then you might want to choose a very delimited system boundary and analyze that. And that can provide you useful information already. The other thing to say is, applying systems lens can be, and diagnosing and researching a system can be a slippery slope, in the sense that everything can be connected to everything. And so at some point you need to say enough is enough, and I kind of get enough information, and to my objective of doing that system map is it's good enough. Otherwise you can just keep on, and it's a never-ending process. So having a very clear idea of what you want to achieve, then you can backtrack it in a way, to think through how much resource you want to deploy to that. But I'm curious if others have any other thoughts or opinions, or other questions.
A virtual thumbs up from Brian, and an actual hands up from Erin. Go on, Erin.
I have another question. It might be like a set of questions.
And I'm going to pause you very quickly, because Alex has a question in the chat first. So I'm going to go
okay.
Alex, and then I'll come to you, Erin, and then I'll go John.
Yeah, of course.
Just because I didn't want to lose that one. Go on, Alex.
And it was more on the actual work that you have, that you're doing, not necessarily just pertaining to systems mapping. But I had the question in regards to whether or not you were trying to influence system mapping of private investments, or blended capital, or systems capital overall. Also, just a tag on quick question, how often do you see systems mapping and understanding the status quo versus systems listening and stakeholders appreciating the difference between understanding the status quo and actually using it in a material way to change the system?
So on the first question, the goal was definitely always to keep this as broad as possible in terms of the different types of capital that it relates to. That's not, I mean, for us, this wasn't super easy, because you do talk to investors and you constantly get their mindset into the map. But the goal was to create one that is useful for investors, but not only return-seeking private market investors. So we also try to bring in stakeholders that sort of represent different types of capital and the needs of those and the perspectives of those, to make sure that it's as broad as possible. But now we're sort of in the process of, we have this map, we have the leverage points, and now we try to come up with what are the needs of different types of capital. And so for one of the projects that we're going to start, we're thinking about creating a sort of a financial stocks and flow map on top of an existing causal loop diagram that comprises the different types of capital that goes beyond private market investment capital. That's the ambition. I cannot say much as to whether we reach that ambition at the moment.
always the challenge. Thanks, Johannes. Erin, do you want to pop in with your question?
Yeah. Okay, so my question for the back context, we are working working at CSP, but CSP and TransCap are working together on a program educating private wealth holders on investing for systems change. And this is kind of like the question that is coming up is like who should be doing this? And of course, like the answer probably like all private investors should be engaging in this, but I'm starting to like play out the scenario of like, okay, all private investors that we're educating might end up doing system maps, and is that productive? How should people be collaborating on this? And also, like, if assuming that all private investors start doing system mapping, does the map start to change based on the type of investor, or like the investor individual, whoever is leading the mapping process, or and does it change like based on the goal of that one is setting for the system functioning or state? And it's kind of like a load of questions, but then having like all of these kind of pop up right now for me. So I hope that makes sense.
It did. Thank you so much for those questions. And I think it's, again, very useful for us to reflect on it. My take is something that fundamentally distinguishes systemic investing from impact investing is that we start from the challenge and not from the solution. And we start from the system's needs instead of a pool of capital that is looking for solutions to deploy that capital. So deducting from that logic, ideally, you would produce a systems map that is geared towards understanding the feedback loops, the dynamics of that system, the structures of what that system, what's holding it back, what's pushing it forward. And from that analysis, then do matchmaking efforts of matchmaking the right type of capital from the right types of sources to the different types of nodes of that system. If you invert that process and center too much on a type of investor, or one investor, or a couple of investors, then you might be missing out some of the very important nodes of that system that just require different types of capital that those investors don't represent. And so you kind of limit your opportunities of transformation of that system. Now, you could produce a system from a specific investor's lens and have other people participate in that systems map and work it to be a collaboration too. And so other people map other parts of the system, and then you orchestrate with these other players to come everyone together in their shared theme or in their shared vision. And that's actually another important point where you'll have different intentions for the transformation of that system. You'll have different goals, and you'll have different transition pathways to reach a certain goal. And so it's important for you to have some kind of an orchestrated effort to make sure that the investments are directed within one transition pathway to reach that one goal. If that makes sense. Johannes, or anyone else would like to compliment?
Yeah, maybe the only thing I'll add is to the question of should all investors then do systems mapping? And I think this is like there's this tension of the value of the output versus the value of the process comes in again. Because from an output perspective, there is systems maps out there, for example, that very accurately capture the regenerative agriculture system. So probably no need for you to retrace that. We showed that map in the presentation also. But then again, the process of getting there, talking to the stakeholders, bringing them to the table is a very essential part of what we think makes systemic investing distinct. And so that probably is something that needs to be done by every investor, or at least consortia of investors. So maybe there might be a case for all these networks that are out there to align the different investors that are members of these networks on the analysis piece and utilizing the collective intelligence, all of those, and bringing all of them together for stakeholder activation, systems analysis, so that sort of these resources can be shared in an effective way. Just a thought. And something we actually discussed also in Boston when we had this session with members of Tonic, for example.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. I did some work a while ago in the kind of multiple complex needs space. So that's individuals who have experienced homelessness, criminal justice system, mental health problems that often fall through the gap. And we did some systems mapping over a kind of £10 million investment into support services. And we spent a lot of time mapping those systems with support services for homelessness, drug and alcohol addiction, mental health services. And we came up with this whole process of, you know, where we were going to put the grant funding through the National Lottery. And then we did a mapping exercise with individuals who experience multiple complex needs, and the two did not overlap. So where people with multiple complex needs were accessing services and support was not where statutory services thought that they were accessing support. And it completely shifted the investments that we made and the grants that we made into that space, because ultimately the things that they were talking about was the local off license, and like, how do you train your local off license to stop serving you alcohol, and the local hairdressers. And so that's a really interesting way of how who you involve in mapping completely shifts the innovation in services. And a totally different example, this was in a life before TransCap. But yeah, definitely want to think about. John, I'm going to come to you. And then there's now loads of questions in the chat, which is great.
All right, well, I'll try to keep this this question's complex in my own mind, so I don't know if I can actually get it out eloquently. But what I'm getting at is advice from you about how to talk to people that come from mixed backgrounds on systems mapping in the same audience, right? So at Tonic, we've got members that this is new for, like they've never really thought in terms of systems. Maybe they've seen a theory of change for a nonprofit or something like that, but they haven't really thought about it that much. Then we have members that come out of the science or the investing world that inherently think in systems, right? Especially the people in the investing world who have already been thinking like this. And I'm trying to figure out how to balance talking to this about them in the same audience, because I find that one group, the experienced group, often gets stuck on the emergent system complexity and whether you actually are adding any signal to, you know, and versus the way they already map things in their head. And the other group wants to go to the maximum extreme in mapping. And you made a few references in the call about the differences between, you know, complexity systems and all that kind of stuff. But when you're teaching this, how do you balance like different audiences that really are kind of at different places in their journey on this learning about mapping?
Excellent question. I would say, I mean, we sort of in this case we had assumptions that people coming to this call would have basic knowledge. So we had some more slides in the background to if there had been a need to talk more about the basics. From my somewhat limited experience talking about this, even more experienced mappers are always happy to again revisit some of the fundamentals because it's just so exciting to talk about mapping. So I think it's never bad to talk a bit about this, but I also see the problem that you need to bring sort of the people that are new to the space. You really need to get them into the very basics first. I know that we are planning something with CSP and you, Erin. I'm not sure how you are approaching this, but maybe how you and what you and Dominic have talked about so far, maybe that would be instructive at this place to inform John about.
Well, yeah, actually, this is tying back to Albin's work. So that's how we're approaching it. I mean, I'll probably answer it more from like our trainings in general rather than this specific piece, because we haven't like nailed down every aspect of the session and we haven't actually experimented with it. So we could be totally off. But I still think there's like a need for in like the impact space when you're training people from different backgrounds to level set anyways, and just understanding what is the like what Johannes was saying, what are the fundamentals that people need to understand in order to have like the next level conversation. So that's whatever that is for this. I would start with that, and that's I think what we'll do for the program as well. but we are using some of Alvin's work in this session.
Thanks, Erin. Feels like a tricky question to dig into. We've got about 3 minutes left. There's one last question on AI, as well as a lot of chat about just general connecting. Alex, I will pick up after this about whether we want to set something up, if people are interested in a conversation around this within the funding world. But Andre, I don't know if you've got any thoughts around AI use in systems mapping, because you've been testing all sorts of stuff.
Yes. And this links to the first question, which was on the resource level and intensity and the usefulness of the output. Now, we believe AI could be a tool that can help us reduce time and ultimately resource expenditure to build a systems map. And so we are experimenting in how to implement AI, artificial intelligence, and large language models to basically sit through large data sets and kind of help us identify major leverage points, and also help us identify the stakeholders and initiatives around said leverage points. And so we do believe there is value in using AI. Having said that, AI comes with a lot of issues that we also need to be cognizant about. So the same way that systems mapping is, as it's done now without AI, it has its own biases of those who are conducting the systems map and who you're choosing to participate in the process of that systems map. AI has also its own biases, and also biases in how you code and you build your large language models, what kind of parameters, what kind of frameworks and filters you're using to dissect through large data sets. And so again, it's a complex answer, and it's something that we are exploring. There is potential. I mean, AI is already being vastly used, and so and many times for the wrong reasons. And so we think it's fair to be experimenting in how we could use this tool for the quote unquote right reasons. More to come, more to be announced. I think we're at time. What do you think, Hannah? One more question, or let's close it out?
I think close it out. I think it's important to finish on time. Thank you so much, everybody. It's been delightful to see you all.